due to a controversy at the evangelical flagship Wheaton College. Certainly, Christians and Muslims affirm that God is one, but Muslims also deny the Trinity and the deity of Christ. Welcome to Seeking Truth, a podcast exploring issues related to faith and culture. I'm Julie Roys, and you can find me online at julieroys, spelled ROYS.com. Well, this controversy was sparked when a political science professor at Wheaton College, Dr. Larissa Hawkins, claimed that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, and then the college placed her on administrative leave. The college and many supporters said the claim is incompatible with Orthodox Christianity, but others, including some professors, said it is compatible. Well, joining me today to discern this important question are two men who have studied this issue extensively, Dr. Miroslav Volf and Dr. Nabeel Qureshi. First, Dr. Miroslav Volf is the founding director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture and the leading Protestant proponent of the view that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. He has written or edited 15 books, including Allah, A Christian Response. Dr. Volf has an impressive evangelical pedigree. He has a bachelor's degree from the Evangelical Theological Faculty in Croatia and a master's degree from Fuller Theological Seminary. He also has doctoral and postdoctoral degrees from the University of Tübingen in Germany. So, Dr. Volf, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you on Seeking Truth.
I'm delighted to be with you.
And also joining me is Dr. Nabeel Qureshi, a Muslim convert to Christianity who does not believe that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. Dr. Qureshi is an itinerant speaker with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. He also is the author of the New York Times bestseller, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And he, too, has an impressive pedigree, including a medical degree and 2 master's degrees, one in Christian apologetics from Biola University and one in religion from Duke University. Dr. Qureshi currently is pursuing a doctorate in New Testament studies at Oxford University. So, Nabeel, welcome. Great to have you join us.
It's a privilege to be here and with Professor Volf. Thank you, Julie.
Well, great to have both of you gathered. I'm just so excited about having this discussion, and I really think it's going to be insightful for all of us. But I want to start this discussion with a question that actually a listener posed on Facebook. Sarah Maleth asked this question. She said, why does this debate matter to both of you? What is at stake? And obviously there's a lot at stake, and it matters a lot to Wheaton College and to this professor that both would be willing to put their beliefs up publicly and suffer whatever consequences there are for that. But for you personally, why is this important to you? What do you believe is at stake? Miroslav, why don't you start?
You know, I started engaging this question before, obviously, this issue at the Wheaton College arose. And the main motivation for me was is really, you can put it this way, a love of neighbor. And if I put it, it sounds very kind of maybe abstract, but I take it that love rejoices in truth. And love grieves also over untruth. Love will not misconstrue what other people believe. It will not diminish the goodness either of their beliefs or of their behavior. And truthfulness with regard to the other is what motivated me. I believe that the statement that I make, namely that Christians and Muslims do not worship another different God, but the same God, is a truthful statement. Second, I think that when tensions between groups are great, they tend to kind of demonize and misconstrue one another, and it's particularly important in circumstances of this sort to point out to commonalities. I mean to point out, not to construe commonalities, right? We don't construe our views about God. We find out truth about God. We identify them. I think that's the second reason why it's important. And the third reason why this question is important is that it has implications for how we think about relationship of Jews to the God that we worship. Do Jews worship another God, an idol? Or do they worship the true God, not quite adequately understood? That is a fundamental question for the identity of the Christian faith, but it's also a very important question for the relationship with the Jews. I think these are the 3 reasons why answer to this question profoundly and truly matters.
Nabeel, I'm guessing you resonate with some of those same reasons, but you come at this differently. Why is it important to you? Same reasons or some different ones?
Well, thanks, Julie, and thanks, Professor Volf. I know you told me to call you Miroslav, so I'll try that. But just so that the listeners know, Professor Miroslav is far more advanced than I am in my theological training and in what he's accomplished. He's worked with prime ministers. He speaks with CNN and MSNBC, etc. I'm just trying to serve the truth, serve the Lord, and go where God leads me. So I very well could have been one of his students at Yale. There's a big disparity here between he and I, just so we know that off the bat, and I really respect him and what he has to say. The reason why I'm very interested in this topic is, of course, because Islam was what I was raised with, and I understood Islam in a very peaceful sense when I was a Muslim. And so I have a very close place in my heart for people to understand Muslims and love them as well, just like Miroslav does. My parents are still Muslim, my sister is still Muslim, etc. So I really do want people to love Muslims as well. So I really resonate with the notion that we should not demonize Muslims. We shouldn't see them as others. But just as Paul says in the book of Ephesians, we were all once lost. And so that's how we should understand Muslims. So I resonate with that. But the reason why I'm discussing this today is exactly the second reason that Professor Volf mentioned, and that was that we should not misconstrue what others believe, and we should rejoice in the truth. I actually do think that the conception of Allah is significantly different from the conception of Yahweh in Christian theology, so much so that to say we worship the same God is misleading and problematic. So I am hoping to stand up for the truth here. And to be fair as well, I want to say that for a long time when I became a Christian, I did believe that we still worship the same God. But since having learned more and reflected on that more, I disagree with what I used to believe. So I'm not here even to demonize Professor Volf and his views or those who might agree with him. I think that there's good reason to think what he thinks. But at the end of the day, I think I need to stand up for the position that Muslims and Christians worship a different God.
Well, let's jump right into debating whether we worship the same God. And Miroslav, I'd like to start with you, and I want you, if you would, explain what you're really saying by saying that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, because just from me watching what's being said on social media, it sounds like a lot of people feel like, well, you must be a universalist. You must be saying that all paths lead to God and we all worship the same God. And that's not my understanding of what you believe at all. So if you could be clear about what it is that you mean by Muslims and Christians worshiping the same God, and why you think that is indeed a true statement.
Yeah, I think, Julie, you're right. I do not believe, and I do not claim that Muslims and Christians are the same religion. I do not believe, I do not claim that Islam and Christianity are equally true religions. I do not believe that Muslims and Christians believe identical things about God. I do not believe that Muslims and Christians believe equally true things about God. I do believe that in Jesus Christ we have a full and complete self-revelation of God. So why do I say, and what do I mean when I say that Muslims and Christians believe in the same God? Here's how one can put it, I think, succinctly. I do not believe that when I say same God, I mean Muslims and Christians Muslims do not believe in another God, in a sense, another God than Christians, because then they would be believing in an idol. What I at the same time believe is that the conceptions of God, which is what Nabeel has also indicated, that conceptions of God in Islam and Christianity are different, and they can be also very significantly different. I also believe that their conceptions about God partly overlap. As I was thinking about our conversation here, I was listening yesterday to a show, a cooking show, as I was driving, and they were talking about artisan chocolates. And so they were saying how when you enjoy artisan chocolate, you need to get a sense of the smell of the chocolate. And then the person who was running the show, she was smelling two kinds of artisan chocolates, and she said they smell entirely differently. And I thought, really? Entirely differently, right? what she was trying to say is that you can make a significant difference, that you can recognize those differences. And so we use the word different and the same in really interesting and different ways. I believe that Muslims and Christians believe in a God that is, conception of God that is different. Muslims do not believe that God is the Holy Trinity. Muslims do not believe that God is unconditional love. But there are many things that Muslims and Christians believe in common, and I think we should emphasize those things, and we should not forget them. And I would summarize those things in the following claims. I have them. I've argued for them in my book, and I'll end here, and we can then obviously go further. I think the common belief is that Muslims and Christians believe that God is only one and only divine being, that God created everything that is not God, that God is radically different from everything that is not God, that God is good, that God is just and merciful, that God commands that we love God with our whole being, that God commands that we love our neighbors as ourselves, that all 10 commandments that God gives in the Old Testament, except for one, are found also in Quran, so that there is certainly significant difference, but also fundamental and important overlap in our conceptions about God. Referent is the same, conceptions are different, and yet just for that reason we can say that we believe in the same God, differently, partly differently understood.
I had an interesting discussion last night with somebody. I happen to live in Wheaton, so this is all the rage right now. Everybody's discussing this issue. But you bring up, and I think your one statement, that Muslims do not believe in another God, then they would be believing in an idol. That was precisely what we were discussing. Is the Muslim concept of God, is the Muslim God, is it a false God, another God, according to Christians? Is it an idol, so to speak? Or is it an incomplete concept of God, like you mentioned, the Jews would affirm? So I'm curious, Nabeel, you said you used to think it was the same God. Now you don't believe it's the same God. And I'm wondering if you would affirm that, would you say that it is an idolatrous God? It is a separate God, a false God? And I'd like to hear what that journey was like.
Well, it's a pretty complicated issue, and I do want to emphasize that again. I see a lot of people with a knee-jerk reaction when we say, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? Just knee-jerk. No, absolutely not. They worship a false God. It's more complicated than that. The reason why I entered into this discussion in the first place was actually when I read Professor Volf's article where he was talking about the Wheaton controversy. And this is what he says in the article. He says, there isn't any theological justification for Hawkins's forced administrative leave. Her suspension is not about theology and orthodoxy. It is about enmity towards Muslims. More precisely, her suspension reflects enmity toward Muslims taking on a theological guise of concern for Christian orthodoxy. So essentially what Professor Volf is saying, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, is that Christians who think this is an issue, Christians who think that Muslims and Christians worship a different God, are doing so out of hate, are doing so out of a guise for theological concern. And that's where I think he needs to be careful. I think all people should be careful and not have such polarized reactions here, because this is an interesting issue. When we talk about the question of do we worship the same God, it's a fuzzy question. What does that question even mean? Now, when I think about what Muslims believe, what I believed as a Muslim, I believed in a creator God, a necessarily unique being of which there could only be one. And he is the one who created the universe. Christians believe the exact same thing about what God is: omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. So the role of what God is, both Muslims and Christians believe, is the same. But the who of what God is, who is he? Allah is so different from Yahweh that it, I think, is a different God. And this is where I stake my claim. Because I also remember a story of when I was in medical school. As a first-year medical student, I was a Muslim, and lots of people would approach me and tell me that they knew my mom. The first time this happened, I had no idea how they could possibly know my mom. And they would start saying things like, well, your mother's very kind, and she comes to this hospital, and she lives here in Norfolk. And by and large, the details were correct. But at one point, someone illuminated that the person that they had in mind was someone who worked in the hospital. And I thought, wait a minute, no, my mom is not a doctor. She doesn't work in this hospital. So up until that point, they said they knew my mother. We were thinking about the same role, the same what, that of my mother. And they were giving me some characteristics that overlapped with my mother, but there was an essential identity difference where they're saying the woman we're thinking about is a doctor. My mom is not a doctor. So at that point, I realized they're thinking about a different person. When it comes to Christianity and Islam, there's a lot of overlap, just like Professor Volf said. But when it comes to essential matters of who God is, not what he is, but who he is, we have complete disagreements between Islam and Christianity, so much so that I think it's entirely incompatible. The Christian God is three who's, not just one. And Islam doesn't just passively reject the notion of Jesus' deity. It very actively says, if you believe Jesus is God, you are going to hell. Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 72. So it's not just incidental differences, it's a rejection, an explicit rejection of Christian theology. And in fact, Islam makes it so clear that I think Muslims, if you ask them, and if you take a look at the origins of the Quran, even in the foundational texts, it says we do not worship the same God. Now, there is a verse in the Quran that says our God and your God is one, sure enough. But that's inconsistent with the depiction of the Trinity and, of course, the depiction of Jesus. So I do hope we can talk a little bit more about the Jewish question as well, but I think I've spoken enough now. The explicit rejection of the Trinity, the explicit rejection of the deity of Jesus means we're worshiping a different who, which in my mind makes this a different God.
All right, Miroslav, first I would like you to respond to what you did write, saying that there's no theological reason for Wheaton College to remove this professor or to censure this professor, that it is about enmity against Muslims. Do you stand by that, or do you kind of feel you'd like to walk that back a little?
Well, let me put it this way. First, I think that the issue, whether Muslims and Christians believe in the same God, is not at all trivial. And people who, like Nabeel or some other friends that I have, take different position than I do. I do not for the moment think that this is an expression of enmity toward Muslims. I don't think that you have to be that you have to say that Muslims worship the same God in my sense of the word, or that Muslims do not worship an idol in order to be friendly to Muslims. So I think, and that there is an important debate to be had. My statement was about the act of placing Professor Hawkins on administrative leave, a person who fully endorses in letter and the spirit Wheaton's statement of faith, a person who fully endorses it as interpreted by people like Timothy George, people like John Stackhouse, people like myself, even Scott McKnight. I believe that this administrative action is deeply, deeply problematic. I would like to know what motivates it. I'm happy to pull back the statement of enmity, but I don't think that orthodoxy, concern for orthodoxy can, because she has embraced this statement, embraced it actively. It's a difference of interpretation. I don't think the future of the possibility of work should depend on a person on a different legitimate different interpretation, no matter how important it is.
But wouldn't Wheaton have doesn't it, as the administration, as sort of the gatekeeper, so to speak, don't they have the right to interpret that statement of faith in the way that they feel is consistent with their evangelical heritage, and to say, we think this is inconsistent, we think you're saying, yes, I believe in this, I believe in A, but I also believe in not A, and it doesn't make sense? Wouldn't that be a legitimate position to take?
I think it would be a legitimate position to take if this was the understanding of the statement of faith, publicly available understanding of the statement of faith, when Hawkins has signed it, right? So that she would have known, this excludes the idea that Muslims and Christians can be said to worship another God or the same God. I don't think that an administration has the right at any moment to ad hoc issue interpretations of its statement of faith if it can plausibly by many people be argued that that interpretation that somebody else embraces is true. Take, for instance, example of a person like Bruce McCormick from Princeton, who agrees fully with the Wheaton's position, but who said really the burden of the proof is on somebody who takes the position that Wheaton does or Nabeel does, because early Christians, all the way through the councils and through the history, have historically believed the way Hawkins does, the way I do. Not the way Nabeel did when he embraced Christian faith, but not the way Nabeel believes now.
Okay, let me give Nabeel a chance to, I don't know if you want to wade into this. It's a little bit, I mean, it's so related, and it's why we're having this discussion, so I'm fine discussing it, but at the same time, it's not specifically on whether or not Muslims and Christians worship the same God, but would you say, I mean, you look at the early councils, I mean, that predates Islam, so it couldn't be the specific question that they were talking about. That was another question, because Islam didn't come around till the 6th century.
True.
Yeah, so, Nabeel, do you want to wade into these waters at all before we move on to some of your other points?
Sure. I'll just briefly comment on some things. When it comes to Wheaton, I think when the question first arose, the whole context of San Bernardino, of Paris, of Ben Carson's statements about about a Muslim presidential candidate, about Trump and his statements about immigration, the milieu is very charged right now, and I think it is not necessarily a good idea to make important administrative decisions when you have such a politically charged environment. So the question of putting her on administrative leave, if it was for the purpose which Wheaton stated, and Wheaton's stated purpose was that so she can consider what she is saying. We're not going to fire her. She's supposed to think about this now. We'll think about this now. We'll handle this later after we've thought about it some. If that was really their reason, and that was their explicit reason for putting her on administrative leave at the time, then I think that's respectable. I think we should think about these things carefully and discuss them, as Professor Volf has said. But when it comes to the notion that historically Christians have believed that Muslims and Christians worship the same God, I would have to question that. I think now the average Muslim, and I'll just give you some insight into how the average Muslim sees his faith, they're not as oriented as the average Protestant towards pure doctrine and systematic theology. The average Muslim is much more oriented towards praxis, how they're supposed to live their Islamic life, fiqh, the principles of aqidah, how you're supposed to, every single day pray your prayers and think about Allah and thank Him during meals, etc. That kind of way of life is what the average Muslim is much more concerned with than systematic theology. So when I became a Christian, I started looking more into the theological components of Islam. And there is no doubt whatsoever that Islam rejects the Christian notion of who God is. And you're absolutely right. Nicaea happened in 325 AD. Chalcedon happened centuries before Muhammad and the Quran as well. So by the time Muhammad comes, and this is fascinating because I just read the Common Word document again this morning just to make sure I was on the same page. The Common Word document, which Professor Volf refers to quite a bit, I'm not sure if he's actually part of it. I think he was.
Can you just explain that real quickly? Because probably some people listening have no idea what a Common Word is.
So the Common Word document is, and Professor Volf will be able to do this much better than I, but it's an effort to come together between Christian and Muslim theologians to say that we worship the same God, we live on the same principles. Yes,
I don't think
I clarify.
Yeah, no, I think that wouldn't be quite right. The Common Word document is a document that 138 leading Muslims from around the world have written in response to a lecture that Benedict XVI gave in Regensburg, in which he drew a contrast between a Muslim God who is a pure will and a Christian God who is reason. And in response to that, the group of 138 leading Muslims, have stated that there's something that binds Christians and Muslims. There's no comment about the sameness of God at all. There's something that binds them, and that is love of God and love of neighbor. Great commandment in the New Testament, which is also the great double commandment of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, is also fundamental to Islam, and that's where Muslims and Christians can find unity. The question of the same God emerged later on because we've organized a conference about this, have a Yale response to this issue, because the question immediately then arose, of course, in my mind. Well, do Muslims and Christians mean the same thing by neighbor? Do Muslims and Christians mean the same thing by God? Do Muslims and Christians mean the same thing by love? And central of the question of these three questions is their conception of God? Is their God the same? And that's how the question of the same God emerged.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification. That's helpful. Nabeel, I want to let you finish your thought there.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So just to finish up that thought, in that document, for example, there's a reference to Surah Al-Ikhlas, which is the first chapter I learned as a Muslim boy. I was 3 years old when I learned to recite it. Qul huwallahu ahad. Say that He is God the One. Allahu Samad, the God who is besought of all. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. Now pay attention to this, because this part was not quoted in the Common Word document. He is not a father and He is not a son. God is not a father and God is not a son. Now Muhammad of this chapter of the Quran says that 1/3 of the value of the Quran is found in this chapter. And all the chapter really is a rejection of fatherhood and the rejection of the sonship of God. And so when we talk about the emphasis of what Islam is teaching, Tawheed is the belief in the unity of God. It's the central core doctrine of Islam. It's a rejection of the Trinity. That's all it really is. And this is why throughout the Quran we have verses which say that the Trinity is something that can lead someone to go to hell. Chapter 4, verse 171, for example. So when we talk about the theology systematically of the Quran, not what Muslims tend to be told today. A lot of Muslims don't know some of this stuff. They won't know these verses. But when it comes down to the actual theology, when we take a look at what Islam has originally taught, it has very clearly said that the Trinity is blasphemy, that Jesus' deity is blasphemy. And I know Professor Volf talks in his book that the conception of the Trinity is wrong in the Quran. I agree with that. But at the same time, I think that the attempt was made to explicitly deny Christian theology. When it comes to the questions he asked about who is neighbor and who is God and what is love, I think Islam answers each of those three questions differently. The Quran says in chapter 98, verse 6, that Jews and Christians are the worst of creatures because they don't accept Islam. Chapter 9, verse 33 of the Quran commands Muslims to subjugate Christians and Jews. So who is our neighbor? The conception is very different in Islam. So superficially, when we fly at about 30,000, 35,000 feet, we can find commonalities and say that this is the same God with the same principles, the same ideas, more or less. But I think when we actually get down into the details, we find a God who is very different. One last verse I want to quote for you. Chapter 5, verse 18 of the Quran. This is the one verse where it seems like Allah is talking about whether or not He loves people. And Jews and Christians say that, He is our Father and He loves us. The Quran in chapter 5, verse 18 explicitly says, God, do not say that. God does not love you. You're just one of His creatures. So this is a very different conception of who God is, and I think we need to draw this into the discussion as well.
Let me just mention, too, while we were talking about the common word, there's one thing that you said, Miroslav, that I'm not sure is accurate in the sense that there was no indication from Wheaton that it would disagree with this statement that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. A common word was initially signed by the president of Wheaton College at the time, which was Dr. Duane Litvin. Then he actually took his name off of it when he began to get some pushback, maybe rethought his stance. And that was not as bold a statement as Christians and Muslims worship the same God. As you pointed out, it was more looking at the commonalities of the faith, as in love for neighbor and so forth. So I would say that there probably was some indication from that Dr. Hawkins could have known where the college administration stood, because it did clarify itself at that point. But let me allow you to respond to what Nabeel said, saying, okay, the role of God is the same in a lot of ways in Islam, what He is as creator God, as unique and one. What's not the same is who He is, and pointing out not father, not son, even the neighbor isn't the same, because we're to love our neighbors, and here a lot of the Quran seems to indicate that we're to subjugate our neighbors who will not say that there is one God and His name is Allah and Muhammad is His prophet. I probably didn't say that specifically right.
No, I'd be happy to respond. I think that's too strong of a statement or summary with regard to what the Quran said. And there obviously, just as in the Bible, there are many verses, and it's very easy to cherry pick verses from both of our texts. But let's put it this way. Nabeel says Christians believed in their three who's rather than just one who. Now that's a very controversial and on the whole unorthodox statement. Most fundamentally, I think Christians believe that God is one, right? It's the unity of God that is absolutely fundamental to the Christian faith. And if it weren't, the whole long debates, Trinitarian debates, would not have taken place at all. But the idea that God's unity is there, and that then question then becomes, well, how do we see the differentiation or internal differentiation of God? That's really what's there at stake. I think my response to anyone who says that Quran's denial of the Trinity. By the way, when Quran denies the Trinity, Quran denies that God has an associate. No right-minded Christian believes that the Son of God is God's associate. That's a heretical view of the Trinity. It's a heretical view of the Trinity if you take any of the great teachers of the Church after Nicaea. But in any rate, I think for me the central issue, and I think that's what I was referring in some of my earlier comments. For me, the central issue is Jews of Jesus' time, Jews of Paul's time, Jews of St. Luke's time have rejected Jesus, have rejected precisely claim of Jesus to be the Son of God, and yet at the same time, John's Gospel very clearly in John 8, Apostle Paul very clearly in Romans 10, Luke very clearly in Acts 4 and other places, assumes and states that the God is the same. At stake is in John's Gospel, what is at stake is, are Jews properly the children of God? What is at stake is, does Jesus have the right to make a claim to be the Son of God? At stake is not whether that God to whom he refers and they refer is the same God. It would have been very easy for John to say, no, wait a second. What are we debating here? You folks worship an idol, and I know Jesus would have said, I know who God is, and there's no debate about this, right? But that's not how the debate goes, right? It goes in such a way to assume that God is the same, which is to say it's possible to have differences both on Christ's divinity and on the doctrine of the Trinity, and still claim that we worship the same God, a God who is very differently understood. That's granted. But nonetheless, the same object is being referred to, and that is significant. The same object who have very similar moral attributes, some different moral attributes, but very similar at the same time. There is no, from my understanding, there is no unconditional love in the Quran. That is for Christian faith, that is a fundamental conviction. It informs our doctrine of the Trinity. It's part of our reason why Christ came to save the lost, why Christ died on the cross. It's part of the justification of the ungodly by grace. It's a part of the commandment to love one's enemy. It goes like a red thread through whole Christian faith. That's how Christian faith, among other things, is significantly different. But still, there are significant commonalities, and we can say that Muslims do not worship an idol, just like Jews do not worship an idol, present-day Jews and the Jews of Jesus' time.
All right, Nabeel, I would love for you to respond to that. And I do think this is the strongest argument, because it is true. The Jews do deny the deity of Christ, deny the Trinity, yet a Christian normally wouldn't have a problem with saying we worship the same God.
Yeah, I'd like to briefly express gratitude that Professor Volf has clarified that the expression of enmity was on the administrative leave issue and not on this position. I'm glad that he's clarified that. I'm also glad that he has stated that unconditional love is not present in the Quran. I do think that that is a central component of who God is in Christianity. He is the unconditionally loving God because he is the triune God who's always existed eternally in love. It's an amazing thought, which is denied by Tawheed. Now, what I do want to clarify, though, is the brief statement about cherry-picking. I'm not cherry-picking the Quran. I'm not going through and pulling out proof texts. I'm explaining what has driven Islamic theology from the inception until the 20th century, at least until the 19th century of Islamic history, are these verses that I am propounding. Now, just to give you a little bit of clarity here, the Quran does have verses that tell people to love Jews and Christians, that Jews and Christians are your neighbors, that there is no compulsion in religion. Surah Al-Kafirun, chapter 109 of the Quran, is all about coexisting with people that disbelieve in Islam. Now, those were the earlier sections of the Quran. Chapter 9, which is the last major section of the Quran to be revealed right before Muhammad died, is the section that I'm quoting from. It is the one that Muslims saw as their marching orders. This was the section of the Quran that launched the Muslims into conquest after Muhammad died. They conquered Persia, they conquered Egypt, Cyrenaica, into Spain, almost into Paris, and all the way east to India. Because of chapter 9 of the Quran. These were their marching orders. And that is the chapter which tells Muslims to nullify all treaties with polytheists and to subjugate Jews and Christians until they feel themselves humiliated or subdued, depending on how you translate the word. Chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. This is the same chapter that told Muslims that if they die in battle, they'll go to heaven. If they don't die in battle, they'll get money. So go ahead and fight in battle. It's the best thing for you. In fact, if you do not fight in battle, you're probably not a believer. That's what chapter 9 of the Quran says. So it's not me cherry-picking. This is the culmination of Islamic theology during the time of Muhammad's life. These were the final marching orders, and that's what set the tone for Islam throughout history. And that's why radical Muslims are doing what they're doing today, by the way. It's because they're trying to get to the purest form of Muhammad's teachings. They're going past all these centuries of accreted Islamic tradition, the schools of thoughts, the madhahib. They're going back to what Muhammad taught. They're going back to what the Hadith and the Quran say. And in so doing, they become radicalized. So I think it's very important. I just want to clarify that this is not cherry-picking. This is a systematic approach that Muslim scholars themselves have concluded. Now, he does say when the Trinity is denied in the Quran, that is saying that there's no associate with God, something Christians would agree with. And I agree. I think he's right about that. But what the Quran is trying to do is to deny the Christian Trinity, and it does so in words such as God is not a father, God is not a son. That chapter of the Quran is worth a third theologically of the entire Quran. Fascinating that much emphasis will be placed on rejecting the Christian Trinity. Again, something that had been established centuries before. And that's where the analogy breaks down with Jews. Because when he's saying the Jews of Paul's time, the Jews of Luke's time, they didn't necessarily accept Jesus, therefore how could they be worshiping the same God? This theology was still being propounded. It was still being hammered out on the anvil of history. It hadn't been firmly established by that time. So the point I want to get across is when Jews today, when we talk about Jews today, they do not reflect the Jews of Jesus' time. The Orthodox Jews today do not reflect first century Hellenistic Judaism. They reflect Rabbinic Judaism, which was formed from the second century, late second century onward. From the time of Jesus, that was Hellenistic Judaism, a different kind of Judaism. And in that time, many Jews did believe in one being God with multiple persons. Now, I suggest that for anyone who's shocked by that statement, they read the work of two Jewish scholars. One's named Alan Siegel. He wrote a book called Two Powers in Heaven. It's a good place to start. And another by the name of Daniel Boyarin, an Orthodox Jew. Both of them argue that there were beliefs of plural personhood in the singular being of God during that time in Hellenistic Judaism. What's my point? My point is Islam specifically denies the Trinity. It rejects the Trinity. It hears what it is, and then it denies it. Whereas that's not the case with the Jews of Jesus' time.
Would you say, though, Nabeel, can I just ask you, would you say that the Jews of today, though, would you have a problem if a Christian said to a Jewish neighbor, hey, we essentially worship the same God, you worship God the Father, you don't accept Jesus, but God the Father and your God, essentially the same.
You see, and I'm not as theologically or perhaps even as sociologically orientated as Professor Volf is. He might think more in modern terms. I'm not useful to anyone. I stay in universities and I study ancient texts. And so when I consider what Judaism is, what Jews are doing today, for me what resonates is the texts which they're studying, the Old Testament text, the Hebrew Bible, of course. And in that text, that's why I'm looking to determine whether they worship the same God or not. Their conception of that text, maybe they're interpreting the text correctly or incorrectly, whatever, but I'm going back to their foundational text, and there is no rejection in those texts of the Trinity. Far from it. I actually see throughout the text of the Old Testament a belief in the plurality of the one God.
And from my understanding, and Miroslav, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Jews accept, obviously, all of the Old Testament, every word, every concept, completely accepting. However, Muslims kind of pick and choose from both the Old Testament and even some Christian concepts, and their concept of Allah is very different in that sense, because it's not saying, yes, we affirm everything in the Old Testament, all the law, the prophets, or writings. It is, we've kind of picked and choose, rejected some, and added some of our own. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I think, to my understanding, that's quite correct. But I think what we need to look at is what kind of image of God emerges from, say, Old Testament text. Let's abstract a little bit from New Testament, from Old Testament text, and what account of God emerges in Quran. I would say that the picture of God is quite similar. If anything, I would say that the God of the Old Testament is further away from unconditionality of love that we found revealed in Jesus Christ. Right? For instance, look at Joshua, where God commands Israelites to kill not just the enemies, but their wives and children, their oxen and sheep and donkeys and so forth, right? That's a very violent, radical statement. I believe in progressive revelation, and we can say, even that statement can be fitted into Christian understanding of who God is. There's a progressive revelation. And I think that brings me to Nabeel's earlier statement about some of the most aggressive portions of the Quran. When he well knows that this is a highly disputed question in the Islamic Quranic interpretation of Quran, to what extent all the later parts supersede the older parts, how hermeneutically we ought to approach that. And there are many of the most prominent Muslim clerics who would not endorse the interpretation that Nabeel gives, but that who simply say that's really a fundamentalist kind of interpretation that we want to reject, and that of course had influence in the history, but was not necessarily the only, and certainly in recent centuries not the dominant interpretation. My third point, simply plural personhood in God. I think we would have to say, and two powers in God. I think we would say that's heresy from Christian perspective. If you read Augustine, if you read ancient texts, Nabeel, you will say that there are not two powers in God. There's a single power. There's a statement that all the works of God toward outside are one, right? So the kind of sense that there are these two powers independently, or kinds of sense that you've got three people sitting next to each other on three thrones and then acting as a kind of a committee, it's a heretical view. That's how we often imagine it. That's what people who write Shack and read Shack imagine it. But that's not an orthodox account of the Trinity. And that's why I say that actually Muslims reject and Jews reject what Christians do not affirm. That's the statement of Cardinal Nicholas von Cusa. And I think that's quite a correct statement. I know that Muslims reject the fatherhood of God. I know that Muslims reject sonship of God, and there are reasons for that. What's understanding of Father? What is understanding of Son? And in any case, my argument would be, Muslims' rejections of Christian God does not immediately entail Christian rejection of the Muslim God. That's exactly how it is with regard to the Jews. Jews consistently reject Christian understanding of God, Christian understanding of Christ's divinity. Consequence is not, we'll do to you the same as you do to us. You reject us, we'll reject you. Or your rejection implies our rejection. I don't think that's correct. I think we have to stand on the grounds of our own sacred text of the Bible and then make our discriminations and not be influenced by the kinds of claims one finds in Quran about Christians or the kinds of claims that one finds in Jewish texts about Christians as well.
Okay, if I could summarize, and I want to make sure I get this right. You do affirm, though, the Muslim concept of God is a conglomeration of some of Judaism, some of Christianity, and then some that's unique. Is that correct?
You're asking me,
yes.
Julie?
Yes, I am.
Yes. It's very hard to actually trace all the influences on shaping of the conception of God. It's actually, by the way, very hard to trace all the influences of shaping of the Old Testament understanding of God, right? Where the influences from outside come, how they were incorporated, and so forth. I think what we have to deal with is what we find before us and what normative traditions plausibly argue for. Yes, I think Quran has borrowed from Christian sources. Quran has borrowed from Old Testament sources, from different sources. That's right. But I have to take a look at it as it kind of stands as the key Muslim teachers interpret it.
Okay. Nabeel, did you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think I do find it kind of shocking to my system to hear that the God of the Old Testament might be further away from unconditional love than the God of Islam. What we have in the Old Testament is a beautiful expression of God's grace consistently throughout. Of course, even the teaching, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, love your neighbor as yourself, comes from Deuteronomy. But not only that, when we see the battles in the Old Testament, including the battles in the land of Canaan, what actually happened? Well, it was to Abraham that the promise had been made that his descendants would have that land. But God says to Abraham in Genesis 15 that it would have to wait 400 years because the Amorites and their sin has not yet come to its fulfillment. It has not reached its full measure. In other words, God is saying, I know what those people are going to do. I know that they're going to sin, and in 400 years from now, they're going to reach a point of no return in their sin, and your descendants will claim that land at that time. But for now, I'm going to be gracious and withhold. The same thing happens with the Ninevites, with Jonah.
But Nabeel, wouldn't you say, I fully agree with you that the idea of gracefulness, of mercy of God, is all over the place in the Old Testament. By the way, it's all over the place in the Quran. But do you think that you want to somehow, from Christian standpoint, from the standpoint of, say, Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount, do you want to say that what Joshua, the command to destroy women and children and animals, is compatible with the Jesus statement for of love for the enemy? I don't think it is. I think that's a development of the doctrine. We have to say, in the light of the statement of Jesus, God makes God's sun to shine on the good and the evil. Be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. Love your enemies. That seems to me to go beyond what you find in the Old Testament and
Professor Volf, I don't think so. I think that's part of the issue. I agree with you, but I think what we're also forgetting is that in the Old Testament, when it came to the human instrument which God used in order to enact his justice, that instrument was the Israelites or the Hebrews at that point. When it comes to the instrument that God uses, and he does enact terrible, horrifying justice through a human instrument in the New Testament, but of course it happens through himself, through his incarnation. So what we have is
through incarnation. You mean Jesus?
Yes, exactly. So what we have is we both have grace, tremendous grace, and we have tremendous justice that's being doled out on humanity by God, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And I don't think you have a development of this notion of grace. I think it's a different expression of that notion. But particularly what I want to take us back to is your comparison of that to the Quran, where you have, again, in the summative, in the capstone chapter of the Quran, please hear me on this. This is not just, the only people, as far as I know, the majority of Muslim scholars who've agreed with this I don't even think the majority of Muslim scholars disagree with this today. I think only those who are Western Muslim scholars disagree with this today, by and large.
No, that's not
but
true.
the majority of Muslims throughout history have agreed that chapter 9 is the final chapter of the Quran as far as the final major chapter of the Quran, and that there is this component of abrogation where later sections repeal earlier sections. And what we have in this is specifically, this entire chapter is called the disavowal, Surat al-Bara. And so it's disavowing things that were said before. It's disavowing treaties. It's disavowing peace between Muslims and polytheists, Muslims and Jews and Christians. And this is the final step that was given to Muslims. And in this case, you do have fight the Jews and Christians until they pay the ransom tax and feel themselves humiliated. Why? Chapter 9, verse 30 tells us. Because Christians say Jesus is the Son of God, Allah's curse be on them. And that's why you have 2 verses later that Islam will prevail over every other religion. We have the same thing in chapter 48. The point I'm trying to make with you, Professor Volf, is that in the Old Testament, when you have a section of people upon whom God's justice is being meted out through the Israelites, that was one people for one time, a very limited thing that was delayed for 400 years. Whereas in the case of Islam, there was no limitation. I enjoin you to read chapter 9 of the Quran. It doesn't say only these specific people, only this specific place. It was the final marching orders given to Muslims on account of which they conquered 1/3 of the known world. It's not at all the same kind of command.
But a command is. I agree with you. I agree with you in the sense that it is the last chapter, but last kind of culminating. Culminating would be too hard, but it's a last statement which many people believe abrogates what was in the past, but many Nabeel do not believe that. Many of the most prominent. Just let me finish. Many of the most prominent actually do not believe that. But even let's assume that you are right. Let's assume that you're right. Now look at the New Testament, and Apostle Paul. He was a persecutor of the church, out to utterly and completely destroy the church. Then when he talks about his conversion, then he tells it to other people, to the Jews, other Jews, assuming that they believe in the same God. I can give you verses on this, and he basically says, "You have the zeal just like I did, but this is not according to knowledge. You're completely misconstruing what it is that God wants and desires for you to do." Now, my interpretation, even of such statements in the Quran, is such. The background belief in God is the same. Referent is the same, but this command obviously cannot be right. They're misconstruing what it is that God wants them to do in zeal to do what God wants them to do. But it's the God who wants them to do this. But they're misconstruing this. There are portions of the Quran that are misconstruals, in my judgment, of what it is that God does. There are portions that are misconstruals of who God is, right? But that does not deny that there is that they worship. That does not imply that they worship an idol. Just like it doesn't imply that Jews, Apostle Paul, who was zealous destroying the church, worshipped an idol before he embraced Christian faith, that Jews worshipped an idols who continued to persecute the church at that time.
Okay, Nabeel?
I want to clarify that I haven't used the word idol. I'm not accusing Muslims of idolatry. I'm just saying that the conception of who God is, according to Islam, is so substantially different in its essence that it is tantamount to being a separate God, a different kind of God. Now, I'm not going to attach the word idolatry to that because that comes with a whole host of connotations, which I don't think it would be a worthwhile endeavor to define currently, but I would say that the essence is different enough. And I think you have also implicitly agreed to that to an extent. You have said that the Muslim rejection of the Christian God does not necessitate or imply the converse. So in a sense, you're agreeing with me, just as in a sense I'm agreeing with you, that when it comes to the role of what God is and some overlaps in what that God has done, gives us some ground to say maybe this is the same God. But when I take a look at the differences, they come in the essential characteristics of who God is. And the reason why this is so extremely important is because what is it that allows God to be as gracious as he is, such that he extends mercy to us all, this unconditional love to us all? It comes from the fact that he is a triune God. Because you have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit living eternally within a relationship of love, love has eternally existed. It is the principle through which this universe was created. And on account of that, God's love for us is unconditional. He is our Father, which the Quran denies in chapter 5, verse 18. And so you have this basis set up through which God will then incarnate, come into this world, and take our sins upon himself. Again, something that the Quran denies. Allah does not come into the world according to the Quran. It is not meet for people to see God. He remains behind a veil, says the Quran. Not so in the Bible. This God is willing to enter into the world, to suffer, to wrestle with us, to dine with us, to suffer for us, so that we can be with him forever. The gospel message is predicated on the person of God in the Bible. And once we deny that, once we say that we worship the same God, then they're not going to understand the basis upon which we proclaim the gospel message, and that's as an extrapolation of who God is. Not just what he is, which could be the same, but who he is, which is essentially important.
Okay, let me just push back on both of you a little bit if I could. Nabeel, you say you don't want to call the God of the Muslims an idol, yet at the same time, I mean, we have, for example, Gabriel revealing to Muhammad, right, who he is, who Allah is, and the creation of the Islamic faith. Who was Gabriel? Who was this Gabriel that came to him?
Interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Because, I mean, there's not a neutral spiritual zone. Either you're in the camp of darkness or you're in the camp of light. There doesn't
or
seem
you can even put it this way, even if you don't put it as sharply as you did, Julie, just to emphasize your point.
Yeah.
I mean, God is either one, and if it's not identical as a referent, not in terms of the features, characteristics, then it must be a second one next to it. And then it must be, from Christian standpoint, who believe in only one God, just as Jews do, it must be an idol. So idolatry necessarily follows from the claim that Muslims worship another God.
Okay, so Nabeel, let me just pose that to you. Can you really say, if you're not going to say it's the same God, doesn't it kind of have to be an idol or a false God?
You know, and I'm not gonna die on this hill. Maybe not. I haven't thought about it in those terms. For me, I mean, I haven't thought about it in terms of idolatry. I've thought about it in terms of the essential characteristics of who God is. So, you know, I'm not going to say something I haven't thought about. Maybe it does, but I don't think it does. There's something in me that says maybe idolatry doesn't necessarily follow. I don't know. But as far as your question about Gabriel, for example, in some of these terms, I think this is relevant too. In Sahih Bukhari, Volume 9, Book 87, Hadith number 111, what we have introduced as Gabriel is first introduced as Namus. And I'm not sure if we know that. I didn't know that until I started researching this. But it was a separate name which was later re-identified as Gabriel. And when you look in the Quran, you see this kind of fluidity of semantics. You see terms that tend to overlap between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but the semantic content of those terms is different, often much more fluid in Islam. Yeah, how do I see Islam? This is what I understand Islam to be. I don't understand it to be simply a continuation of Judaism and Christianity. I see it to be an amalgamation of all the things that were present in 7th century Arabia. When you have Muslims praying 5 times a day, where did that come from? Well, the Zoroastrians prayed 5 times a day, depending on where the sun was. When you see people doing the pilgrimage to Mecca, running back and forth between Safa and Marwa, throwing stones at these pillars of Satan, doing these traditions. Where did those all come from? Kissing the black stone, which is in the corner of the Kaaba. Those were all pagan traditions that existed in the time of Muhammad. When you have them incorporating the people of the book in the scripture, now we're talking about Jews and Christians. So we have a variety of things that are rolled up together, making this much more complex than a simple idolatry, non-idolatry issue, I think. So like I said, I don't want to stake a claim on something that we haven't thought carefully on. That's my whole premise behind this conversation. We shouldn't point the finger at people and say, well, this was done out of hatred, or well, you don't really understand what you're saying. We shouldn't do that. We should be much more careful about this. But I do conclude that the essential differences between who God is conceived in the Quran versus the Bible makes this a different God. That's where I'm standing, and that's where this conversation is coming in today.
Well, and let me just say where I'm coming from as I've wrestled with this issue. From a missions background, understanding that missionaries go into cultures, and they often look for, there's a gentleman who wrote Peace Child, also wrote Eternity in Their Hearts, but just an excellent book talking about going into a culture. You look for how has God revealed himself to this culture. And, usually there is some way that God has revealed himself. And so you're able to, as a missionary then explaining the gospel, able to connect with the concept of God that the people already have. Because there usually is some concept of a God of love. And there's often a concept of a Satan, an enemy. So it would seem to me that if we were going to say it's the same God, from a missiological kind of perspective, you would say, you might go to the Muslims and say, you have an incomplete understanding of God, but it's basically the same. Let me build on that and explain to you who God really is. However, my question is, as we look at what Muslims truly believe about God, do we see something that's very compatible where we'd say, oh yeah, this is an incomplete concept of God, or do we see as, and this is the one analogy that resonates with me, I don't know if you're fans of the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis, but in the last battle, you have a donkey that puts on a lion costume and says that he's Aslan, who is the God figure in those Chronicles of Narnia. And so he's actually an imposter of God. And so my question is Islam, is it an imposter God, or is Islam an incomplete concept of God? Because that, and maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but as I look at it, that's really at the root of the question there. Miroslav, why don't you go ahead and respond?
Yeah, no, Julie, I think that is the fundamental question, right? Imposter God is and some Christians have claimed that demonically inspired imitation of who true God is. That is to say, then the God of Islam in this interpretation is an idol and a competitor to the true God. I would say myself, it's not just a question. By the way, many of the missionaries and people who work in Muslim lands have written to me after reading Allah and said to me, finally, somebody has articulated this. Somebody has articulated how we can articulate Christian faith just as you described and build on what is there, but lead into something that is much deeper. I think for missionary purposes, that certainly is a better approach. I think in generally that's a better approach because I believe it's a truthful one. But I don't think it's a matter of simply completion and incompletion. There is also correction. It's not that you have something that's already fully there in any of the missionary situation, and now you add something to it simply, right? That will be completing it. I think what you almost as a rule find is something that is almost there, but something needs to be subtracted from it, something needs to be shifted and changed, and something needs to be added. So there's a kind of complex process that's going on of purification of beliefs that are there, building on something that might be common. And I think when it comes to Islam, and I'm sure that's how many Muslims think of it from the other end about Christians as well. But I, as a Christian, think of it. Obviously, what Nabeel was saying about triune nature of God, who is unconditional love. Nabeel was preaching the message that I preached. The entirety of my theology is rooted precisely in this as a very heart of Christian theology. But I think we can lead others to that. We can find connections from others, from in a Muslim, in Islam, to that conception of God, and then engage in productive debates about that very issue. One just final comment, and Nabeel returned back to the question of Wheaton. I think my point is, again, just to emphasize, this is not an important theological question. Obviously, passion with which both Nabeel and I speak indicates that it is. I think it is not a sufficient grounds. Theological concern is not a sufficient ground to deny somebody or to revoke somebody a tenure who has a tenure, or even to suspend. I think you would have to make an argument for suspension rather than having the person who's been suspended think about whether she agrees or not and what is the case. So I think the burden of the proof lies on Wheaton's administration, and in this particular case, not on Hawkins. All right,
Nabeel, I'd like you to respond to the imposter versus incomplete God, and then if you'd like to comment on the Wheaton thing as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, I wonder if those are proper terms in which to be thinking of this, or if we've set up a false dichotomy here. I'm just wondering if there are more options. I don't want to first decide what the end result of my investigation would mean. In other words, I don't want to decide how I'm going to think about it by saying what are the ramifications of my conclusion. I want to actually think about the matter first and then see what the conclusion leads to. So, for example, with Professor Volf, I see a very noble endeavor of trying to increase friendship and relationship between Muslims and Christians in order to have peace around the world and also to discuss these matters on the basis of common ground. And I agree with that sentiment entirely, but I would not want to let that sentiment guide my conclusions. So on this question of imposter versus incomplete notion, like I said, I'm not sure those are our only two options, but I'm not going to let those two options guide my thoughts. I'm going to actually take a look at the issues first. So once again, I'm not sure if those are the only two options. I'm not leaning towards one or the other right now. I'm looking at the fact that the Christian God is in his very nature triune, and that is extremely essential to the Christian view of who God is and what he has done. And by denying that aspect of God as vociferously as Islam does, it's not a peripheral issue in Islam. It is the central theological issue of Islam to deny the Trinity. So when it denies it as vociferously as it does, you cannot say it's the same God, because you've denied the most essential component of who God is. And so,
but they deny Trinity, that they misunderstand the Trinity.
I'm not sure. It's more than just a misunderstanding. It's an intentional denial. Now, I do think the Quran does misunderstand the Trinity, so I have to agree with you on that. I think what the Quran actually does is it denies tritheism. I think it denies Jesus, Mary, and God. But it is attempting to deny the Trinity, and it does so through, I think more accurately, through, for example, Surat al-Ikhlas. He is not a father, he is not a son. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. And so whether or not it gets the doctrine right, it is trying to deny it very, very intentionally. And so, but
trying to deny something that it has gotten wrongly, right?
Let him finish.
Please let me finish on
Go
this.
ahead, Nabeel.
Yeah. When you deny the deity of Christ, you deny the Trinity as well. So it's whether or not directly or indirectly, it is trying to deny the Trinity, and it effectively does by denying the deity of Christ. And so I do think that's extremely important when we consider the issue of the Trinity. I don't think we can just say, well, you got the Trinity wrong, therefore it doesn't effectively deny it. No, I think it does effectively deny it, though it didn't quite explicate it appropriately, which itself is an issue. Why does the Quran why does it get the Trinity wrong, I think is an interesting issue as well. But before we get sidetracked, I do want to get back to this thing about Wheaton, since it is the grounds by which we are having this conversation. I agree with you. If that is their grounds for permanently suspending Professor Hawkins, that would be something that I would ask them about too. But if it's their grounds, as they initially stated, I'm not sure they've come back and retracted their statement, but they initially stated this is just so that she can think it through. And by implication, I think it was so that they could think it through as well. I don't think it's necessarily a bad move. What scares me is when you said that this is hatred. And if they didn't have sufficient ground, if the burden of proof is on them to suspend her, I think the burden of proof is on you to prove that this was hatred as opposed to a theologically motivated endeavor.
Miroslav?
On my claim that it is an expression of enmity toward Islam.
I'm sorry, not hatred. Sorry, enmity. Yes.
Right. I think I used the word enmity if I recall correctly. I think you may be right. Even if I believed that it is true, I should not have quite stated it that way. I think it is burdened. I think I have to show in a much better, compelling way than I have in that piece that this is in fact the case, that something like cultural sensibilities that inform some swaths of Republican Party have seeped in from in varieties of ways into the reflection of the matter, so that somebody who agrees with the Wheaton statement of faith but says something positive about Muslim account of God and Christianity in relationship with this has to be immediately pushed back. My sense is that that's true, but I agree with you. I think I shouldn't have made the claim without justifying it much more than I'm able now, or that I was able to do then. I think that's quite correct. On the question of the Trinity, why did Quran get the Trinity wrongly? Why do so many Christians get it wrongly? It probably got it wrongly because of the popular Christian conceptions around. And we Christians get it wrongly because it is an immensely complicated thing, precious as the most precious of the jewels that exist on this planet, much more precious than anything in the world, but at the same time really intellectually very complicated to rightly express and to practice rightly in worship. I think that's the reason why mistakes are made, and that's why I have some understanding for people who don't quite get it rightly. But at the same time, I think I want to make sure that we engage in discussions and explain why, how, so that the dialogue continues rather than the dialogue being closed off.
Well, since we're making corrections, let me just make one. That was Don Richardson who wrote Peace Child and Eternity in Their Hearts. I do think when it comes to the Wheaton situation, it has become very muddied by how political it's become, and some of the statements that Dr. Larissa Hawkins has made afterwards, some of the associations she's had, and this is like the fourth thing where she has clashed with administration. So I think it is probably larger than just this discussion. But I do love that we're engaging on these theological issues as a result. I mean, the nation is talking about them, and not just Christians talking about them. We have non-Christians talking about them with Christians, and I think it's important that we be able to respond in a winsome way, but also in an informed way. One last question, and then we're going to have to draw this to a close, but this is something that somebody asked on Facebook, and I thought it was a valid question. Anne asks, curious if Dr. Volf thinks that Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons also worship the same God. Again, they believe in one God. They believe a lot of the same things that we do. Mormons accept Jesus, which would be even more than Muslims. I mean, are we starting down a slippery slope when we begin to say that two concepts of God that are as similar, yes, but also very different, are the same? And can we then just lump in a lot of other religions as well? Miroslav.
My sense would be that when it comes to Mormons and when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses, again, I consider that there is much to be desired in these versions of Christian faith, if we can call them that way. But nonetheless, that they worship the same God, not properly understood. I think I'm guided basically by in some ways by conception of by the historical conceptions on this matter, so that we do have this broad sense of the unity and oneness of God, of the Creator God, with certain moral laws that are embedded into the nature of God. And then obviously there are clear statements and clear qualifications, so to speak, or put it differently, they perceive God in the way the God that is complete truth and the Trinitarian in nature. They inadequately perceive it and worship God as such, and we ought to honor that and purify their worship. That applies to non-Christians. It applies also to many Christians. It applies to Christian denominations. In some ways, Martin Luther was about this. I mean, he thought that Catholics didn't worship the same God as Protestants do. Why? Because they did not believe in unconditional love. Now, am I going to follow Martin Luther in this? No, I'm going to say yes, unconditional love in the way in which Luther expressed it is actually fundamental to the nature of God. But if Catholics haven't quite gotten it the way Luther has, must I say they don't worship the same God? I don't think I ought to. And finally, this is my final comment. Mm-hmm. My 8-year-old son, when he was 8 years old, had very inadequate conception of Trinity, very inadequate conception of divinity of Christ. He prayed with me every day. Did he pray to a wrong God because he didn't have the conception of God? I don't think he did. Right? So I think that we need to be much more generous in terms of what we affirm as the fundamental sameness, and then fill in that picture with the full, robust self-revelation of God in Jesus Christ, with a Trinitarian nature of God, and so forth.
All right, Nabeel, your final statements.
Yeah, I really do appreciate this opportunity to discuss with Professor Volf, and I appreciate his sentiment here. These issues are more complicated, and if I have one thing that I can enjoin Christians who might listen to this to take home with them, it is to stop rebuking Christian brothers and sisters who disagree with you, and to consider pursuing God more carefully, more thoughtfully, together, seeing it as a common endeavor towards glorifying God by pursuing His truth. So let's not point the finger at people. And I'm really glad to hear Professor Volf say that perhaps you shouldn't have, or perhaps you should have substantiated the statements about enmity more. I do think we need to be careful when we accuse people of enmity and the like. So I'm thankful for that as well. Briefly on Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, the issue with Mormonism is that you ultimately, from what I understand, I am no expert on Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, but with Mormonism, ultimately you don't have a monotheism. You have at best a henotheism, if not a polytheism, where people can become gods. That is, once again, an essential denial of Christian doctrine. A denial of essential Christian doctrine. And with Jehovah's Witnesses, again, if you have an explicit rejection of the deity of Christ, then I think you have a different God you're worshiping. Now, of course, the word Trinity, and I want to agree with Professor Volf on this as well, the word Trinity does not show up in the Bible. What you have is the deity of Christ, you have the deity of the Father and the deity of the Holy Spirit, and the assertion that there is one God, while these three are not each other. That is the scriptural basis for the Trinity. Now, if you reject a Trinity, it's different from not getting the Trinity quite right. And that's the example that he was giving about his son. His son didn't quite understand the Trinity at a young age. I totally understand that. Most people don't, no matter the age. But that's not the same thing as a denial of the Trinity, which Islam is doing. The whole doctrine of Tawheed, whether Islam gets the Trinity exactly right or not, doesn't negate the fact that the doctrine of Tawheed is designed to rebut what the Trinity includes. So that's why this is such an essential issue here. Does that mean we should hate Muslims? Absolutely not. Does it mean we should see them as our enemies? No. Christ was willing to die for us. Romans 5:8, even while we were sinners against him, he was willing to die for us. And then he tells us to love people just as God loves us, so that we can be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. Do not hate people. Do not see them as the objects of our enmity. But at the same time, let's affirm what we believe, especially when it's something that is the basis for the gospel, the Trinity of Christian tradition. Yes, thanks again for this opportunity. And I hope I haven't upset you, Professor Volf, or anyone else who might be listening, but I really do think that Muslims and Christians do worship a different God, but that we should continue to pursue God in truth together.
Well, my thanks to both of you, Dr. Nabeel Qureshi, Dr. Miroslav Volf. I appreciate your thoughtfulness, appreciate the spirit with which you engaged, and I think we've got a lot to chew on, and you certainly helped us clarify, I think, our thinking on this, so thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Well, you've been listening to Seeking Truth. This is a podcast exploring issues related to faith and culture. I'm Julie Roys, and again, my thanks to Dr. Miroslav Volf and Dr. Nabeel Qureshi for joining me on today's podcast. Also, I want to let you know that I'll be giving away 2 pairs of books by both my guests. Each pair will include 1 copy of Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus by Nabeel Qureshi, and Allah, A Christian Response by Miroslav Volf. To enter that giveaway, just go to julieroys, spelled ROYS.com/giveaway by midnight on Sunday, January 24th. Again, that's julieroys.com/giveaway. Here's my take on the issue. Though I agree with Dr. Volf that both Christianity and Islam affirm a monotheistic God, it seems to me that we do not worship the same God. Of course, our God is triune. Islam's is not. We affirm the divinity of Jesus. Muslims do not. But all those things could be said about Judaism as well. And Christians often say that we worship the same God as Jews. But here's the difference as I see it. God to the Jewish people is concept for concept like God the Father, because Jews affirm the Old Testament in its entirety. Islam, on the other hand, accepts only parts of the Old Testament and then rejects others, and then it adds some of its own. And in fact, I would argue that Islam has created a different God by borrowing piecemeal from Judaism and Christianity. Is it an imposter God? You know, I like that we got into that discussion, and I appreciate Nabeel's reluctance to put that label on Allah, on the God of Islam. But I think that's something worth considering. And I think before we jump in and say we worship the same God, we need to look at the fruit of Islam and at the violence, not just the charitable parts of it, which are many. And there are many loving Muslims, and we need to acknowledge that. But again, both these things make me feel like very reluctant to say that we worship the same God. That being said, I think Muslims and Christians have the same desire to worship the one true God, and I think we need to affirm that and lead our Muslim friends in that understanding of Jesus Christ. That's my view. As always, would love to connect with you. To do so, just go to my website, julieroys, spelled ROYS.com. Thank you so much for listening. I would encourage you just to continue seeking truth.